Well, fantastic, and welcome to everyone. So I have the wonderful and delightful pleasure of serving to both welcome, to thank, and to set very briefly context. And I say very briefly to remind myself, because you don't give a microphone to a professor and then expect them to give it up. So I want to both welcome those that I see here in person, right? We're delighted to see such a filled room here at UC Los San Francisco. There's familiar faces, there's new faces, and so it's wonderful. But also I know that we're joined by a whole host of folks online, and that is also really exciting. So welcome to everyone. My name is Talia Gonzalez, and as I said, I'm a faculty member here at UC Law SF, and I also co-direct our Center on Racial and Economic Justice. And so in a welcome and also expressing gratitude, and then setting context, I want to say the following. First, I really want to welcome our discussants, Demointe, Jazz, Ames, Stas, and Rami, right? It is just so wonderful to see you here in person, and we're really privileged that you could be here in person. We are not always afforded those opportunities. We were talking about that over lunch. I also want to extend a gratitude for coming and traveling, right? Travel is fatiguing. Travel takes time. There are gifts and wonderful things that you share within the world that we are now taking you away from. And so it's fantastic to have you here today in that way. And I also want to extend the folks that made this happen, right? We had some really wonderful co-sponsors. We had the Provost and Academic Dean's Office, of course, the Center for Racial and Economic Justice, the Center for Social Justice, the Center for Negotiation and Dispute Resolution. We have the co-director here, Maddie Robinson, in the audience, the National Center for Restorative Justice, and of course, Outlaw and the NLG as well, and really seeing who's in the room, I get a sensibility of what that is. And so I don't normally acknowledge financial support, but I'm going to do so today for the point that I made before, which is we're gathering in person. And we've sort of moved into a time and space where it becomes really easy to gather online. And while that creates an access, right, in ways that we might not always have in being in person, it also changes and shifts the way in which we can express and gather and think. And so I really want to acknowledge that it was the Provost and Academic Dean's Office, as well as the National Center for Restorative Justice, that gave the financial support to fly each and every one of these individuals here, have them here, staying and really experiencing what it is to be here together. And I know that it was amazing, even at lunchtime, to see friends who hadn't seen each other in a while or in person suddenly sharing hugs, right? And suddenly seeing each other in that context. So again, thank you to both those offices, to that office and to the National Center. And so in that context, right, I want to bring us to my last point, which is setting the stage. You know, there are a whole host of conversations that will happen here in a very brief time that we're together, but also there was a genesis to this about a year ago. So there was an investment made when I joined the faculty that we could hold a large full-day convening, asking and more importantly, challenging questions about equitable system design and restorative justice relative to the criminal legal system. And several of the folks that you see here in front of you today were part of that conversation. And in the afternoon, there was a deep dive really thinking about oppression and domination and exclusion, right? Of course, when we're talking about the criminal legal system, but with a really deliberate queer lens. And rather than leave those conversations just in that afternoon session, or as we extended out onto the SkyTech, that time with cocktails, I will be candid, right, and share that. And Rami and I being really excited about shared articles of clothing that we also owned. We started to have these other moments where we thought, why are we not continuing this conversation? And so today then became sort of that next phase. So I really do emphasize the opportunity and ways in which we invest in people to come together. I think it matters. You know, if we are going to meaningfully advance liberation and justice, we want to have all of these domains in which we can operate. So again, a great thank you, not just right to the sponsors and in that way, but really again to the experts that we have in the room. And I say the experts here, but I also look out to all of you and virtually as well, right? The expertise and wisdom that you're bringing to not just this as a conversation or as an issue, but as a deep lived experience is so profound. So with that, that's why I can look at this and say, take the mic away from the professor, please, and hand it metaphorically off to Demointe as they will be leading us in this discussion. So with that, welcome everyone. We're such a privilege to have you here.
Thank you so much. Can everyone in the room hear me okay? And if that ever changes, just feel free to give speak louder to any of us. But yeah, again, thank you all so much for being here, both in person and virtually. My name is Des Moines Ted Wesley. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm an assistant director at the National Center on Restorative Justice, which, as Talia mentioned, is sort of one of the co-sponsors for this event. The National Center is a partnership between Vermont Law and Graduate School, University of Vermont, University of San Diego, and the Bureau for Justice Assistance. And I invite you to learn more about us on the interwebs. But I don't want to take up too much time. I want to allow our esteemed panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves. We're going to be talking about justice through a queer lens, liberation, within and outside of the criminal legal system. So again, I invite, maybe we'll just go down for this round, then we'll pop around. Invite you to introduce yourself with your name, your pronouns, where you call home or this place that you're rooted in, and a little bit about your work.
Starts with me. Can everyone hear me? Great. Okay. My name is Rami El Garib. I use he, him pronouns. I am the Juvenile Justice Program Manager at King County in Washington. I'm also a co-founding member of the Restorative Rainbow Alliance, the first LGBTQ nonprofit in the field of restorative justice. I call Beirut, Lebanon home. I'm from the Middle East. I moved to the US because as a gay man, it's not legal to be queer or openly queer in Lebanon. So I've moved around in the United States between Connecticut, Colorado, Georgia, and now Washington. Hopefully that's my new forever home. So during that time, I have worked on facilitating restorative justice conversations, building LGBTQ safe spaces, and just being in community with folks.
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Stas. I use they, them pronouns. I'm one of the co-founders of Spring Up Collective. We are a collective of transformative justice practitioners, liberatory educators, and care workers. There's a lot of things under the umbrella of what we do. Last year was our 10-year anniversary as a collective, so we've gone through a lot of evolution as a group. My personal background is doing community-based intervention and gender-based violence. I've done restorative justice work as well, and then bringing restorative and transformative practices into workplaces around collaboration, moving against power dynamics, and kind of non-punitive harm response within programs and work teams. I currently call Colorado home. Ute, Arapaho, and Cheyenne ancestral lands. But I'm originally from Florence, Italy, and I grew up in South Florida, and still feel a big part of me in both of those places. But I do think that I end up doing my work largely online with folks who are trying to make changes in the world, largely with queer and trans folks, people of color, and survivors.
Hi, y'all. My name's Ames Stenson. I use pronouns they, them, theirs. Also from Colorado, the home of Ute and Arapaho and Cheyenne folks. And my work, my day-to-day is working in the Inglewood Municipal Court Restorative Justice Program. So we have a diversion program. It's a deferred prosecution for adults, and it's a deferred arraignment for youth in our little tiny town of municipal court here in Inglewood. And that keeps me very busy, and I enjoy that quite a bit. I also get to serve on the board of the Colorado Coalition for Restorative Justice Practices. It's a 501c6 organization. It's a membership organization bringing together practitioners in restorative justice throughout our state. We have over 100 members in our coalition. And then also one of the co-founding members of the Restorative Rainbow Alliance. I just want to give a shout out to our other colleague, Laura Beth Waltz, who isn't able to be here with us today, but the other co-founding members. So really grateful to be here.
Hey everyone, my name is Jasmine Lee Story. Please feel free to call me Jazz. My mom does, so why can't you? My pronouns that I utilize are they, them, and I have come to you from the Black Belt region. I live between Montgomery area out in Alabama and in Atlanta, so the heartbed of the Creek Confederacy. My work has transformed over the decade and some change that I have been involved. I started this work as a student facilitator in undergrad and a student advocate for having expanded options for survivors of gender-based violence within a college university setting. I've done everything from a little bit of appointed government, a little beep life, if you like that TV show, government's as foolish as it looks. And I also have done K-12. So if you've watched Abbott Elementary, I've done a little bit of that. And yeah, being in schools also feels as foolish as sometimes it looks. And most recently, I support the stewardship of 15 acres in Alabama. It's a healing justice project that is also a land back project. And in this space, we center working with justice impacted folk. So everyone who is on a part of our regular team is justice impacted, them being either formally incarcerated themselves or having a close, intimate family member who has experienced incarceration. I'm also the founder of Honeycomb Justice. And head nods to Honeycomb Justice, get out of here. That's wild. I appreciate you all. Honeycomb, our goal is to really provide practitioners of the movement a sandbox for radical dreaming and liberation. So it's a place for us who have day jobs where our RJ may be constricted to feel free to imagine and play while supporting communities that are looking for support. And with that.
All right. Well, thank you so much again for the introduction, you all. It's a beautiful thing being both in person and virtual. But because of that, we are sort of in mixed company. So we have to lay a little bit of groundwork, right? What do we mean when we are talking about restorative justice and transformative justice? So I invite anyone on the panel, what do we mean when we say restorative justice? What is that? What is transformative justice? What is the interplay between the two? Are they or how are they complementary? And then we'll get into what we came here to talk about, thinking about those things through a queer lens. Anybody got thoughts on that?
I wonder if someone else wants to describe restorative justice, and then I can kind of chime in with how it relates to transformative justice.
Sure. So restorative justice in a criminal legal setting is a facilitated process where you bring together folks who have been the most impacted by harm. So when harm occurs, you bring in the person who's caused harm, the person who is the survivor or victim of the harm. And during that session, you discuss what happened, who was harmed, what do they need, and how to repair that harm. And it's a one-time facilitated dialogue, and that would be my definition.
I'd like to say that if you ask 10 different practitioners what the definition of RJ is, you're going to get 10 different responses. So I love that. I like to think about it in the bigger sense of it's a way of being, it's a philosophy, and it's a set of practices that really emphasize connection and healing. If I were to put my hat on for the Inglewood Municipal Court Restorative Justice Program, we define it as restorative justice practices are victim-centered, community-based responses to harm, which create opportunities for accountability, repairing harm, and restoring relationships.
Awesome. Yeah. So I've done work in restorative and transformative justice. I think transformative justice is really zooming in on those community-based practices using pre-existing relationships to address harm. And the root causes of violence as well. So it's not just individual instances, but also kind of the patterns behind the violence that we're perceiving and what are interventions around that. I think they can be very complementary. I think that folks can learn from both toolkits and adapt in the moment. Some of the biggest distinctions I would say are in the roots of the practices. I think transformative justice is really coming out of organizing folks who are directly impacted and know that police, prisons, outside intervention are not likely to be helpful to them, needing to figure out how to address things within their own communities. Whereas I think restorative justice is drawing on other roots, whether that's indigenous practices or faith-based practices or practices that are more focused on criminal legal reform. Transformative justice is really happening outside of those systems. And so I think that my work is really coming out of transformative justice and then learning restorative justice, doing some more inside system work and feeling very restricted in that, particularly on timeframes, the incentive system, who you're accountable to within those processes, and then kind of making my way back out to doing work outside of systems, other than kind of within systems, doing the skills building around that for folks who are already in those situations to have the skills without relying on someone else coming in and doing it for them. So I have dabbled in both. I think in my heart and soul, I'm really deeply aligned with transformative justice. That's who really brought me into this work. But I think that there's no need for them to be inherently oppositional to one another.
The last thing that I would add to the distinction between the two is the infrastructure that also is needed. And I use infrastructure because that is the language English has given me. I think infrastructure could also look like community, or I could use language like networks. So for me, the work that I would do, say on the farm, supporting a community members who experienced harm between them would be dependent, its success would be dependent on the social bonds that we have created before the harm occurred, so that we're leaning on supporting all parties in a way that is as holistic as the harm that has occurred, right? The experience of being harmed, of harming someone else, is a holistic experience. The context of which you stand, and so transformative justice for me leans on the process of community and community as infrastructure, and that being really required. I'm not going to say that that's not a part of restorative justice. I will say that what we have been allowed to do systemically with restorative justice removes a lot of that communal resourcing out of its procedure. And so those would be two distinctions, but I will not say that it doesn't exist in those spaces, but I will say that in my experience with transformative justice, our work is always informed by the bonds that are built prior to and the bonds that have to be rebuilt after.
Beautiful. And of course, those are incomplete definitions. There's so much more that goes into that, but I think that that gives us a good starting place. So as Talia mentioned earlier, one impetus for this particular gathering was this notion of erasure, compounded violence and oppression for queer and trans folks within the criminal legal system, but also within restorative justice spaces. And so again, just to lay a little bit of groundwork, I'm hoping that maybe we can talk a little bit about like examples of that. So then we can get into like, why is a queer lens, a queer approach to justice necessary? So those instances of erasure or silencing, how have we seen that show up in our work and in our spaces? Why is this conversation a necessary one?
So, as I mentioned, moved from Lebanon to the US. So when I moved to the US, I thought, amazing, there's no homophobia here. Everyone's free. And what I came to learn is it's very different than how homophobia is in Lebanon. But anyways, I was in Colorado working for a nonprofit as a restorative justice coordinator. And I was meeting volunteers to get to a sense of what was going on in this nonprofit. And one of the volunteers said, oh, we had a case where a young queer person was being bullied at school for a year and then had enough and retaliated by punching the person who had bullied them. And they got referred to restorative justice, and the young queer person was the harmed doer or responsible person for the harm. And the person who had bullied them is the harmed party. And that's how we facilitated the dialogue. And then the young queer person had to repair the harm to the other person. And I was just shocked, because how could this facilitator not see homophobia or transphobia as a form of violence? For a year, not understanding the layers of trauma that this young person must have had gone through, and then to make them sit down in a space and apologize is silencing queer voices. And so there was a convening in Colorado for restorative justice practitioners, and I brought up the topic of LGBTQ plus needs, and Ames was in that convening as well as others, and we started talking, and there was a lot going on in the field of restorative justice where facilitators were misgendering people in a circle or in a space, where practitioners were setting up their queer clients or participants with their friends who were queer, saying, I know someone who's gay, I should introduce you. Very inappropriate and just really harmful. And so it got to the point of, we need to do something about this, because if we're creating alternatives to the criminal legal system that we have, we need to create one that is safe for queer communities. We can't just recreate what we already have in a way, or we can't just, keep doing what we're doing and 50 years down the line just say, should have thought of LGBTQ plus folks in this space. So, and there's, I'm sure, many more stuff that happens, but we formed the Restorative Rainbow Alliance. That's how we came together. We wrote a code of conduct that was adopted by the state of Colorado for facilitators, so that facilitators could learn how to facilitate or work best with queer folks, created some trainings. And so, yeah, those are some initiatives that we're starting and that we're doing. And it's so important to have a queer lens in this work.
Yeah. Anyone else have perspectives on sort of where we're at? What are the gaps that we sort of need to address?
I mean, outside of this panel right now, I don't know that I've ever been in a restorative justice space where I wasn't misgendered. So I don't think that it's like a once in a while thing. I think it's like the constant grading. I think that also, we were talking about this earlier, but I've been in situations where folks are like, well, you should just be willing to go by other pronouns so that you don't make it about you in this space, or you're making the situation more complicated and forcing people to focus on your experience when it should be about the people involved in the process. And I think that's incredibly inappropriate. I think it's very invalidating of non-binary identity as a legitimate identity. But I also think that it's very patronizing to think that folks in community don't have exposure to queer and trans people, or that there's not a additional benefit to seeing a queer and non-binary person as just part of the team that's supporting you without making it about their identity. I think that there can be a lot of tokenizing of being like, oh, you're the right person when a case explicitly is related to queerness. But if it's not a queer case, then people probably won't feel like you're the right fit for it. Whereas I think that queerness is present in so many more situations than folks recognize or account for. And that when we talk about a queer lens, I think that's not just about like a sexual identity. That is about a worldview and a way of relating to complexity and breaking down binaries. I think from that story, the like power analysis around who's the responsible party and who's the impacted party is deeply skewed, and coming from a very one-dimensional approach to harm. And I think that I think that when we're so focused on how do we get people included in the conversation, we lose the fact that there's so much to learn from including folks. Like there's a benefit of wisdom, of practice, of skill sets that queer and trans folks bring to the table that is not about bringing us to the same conversation, but about realizing that a queer lens actually shifts the way that you understand harm to occur and the skill set you have for how to respond. And I can keep going on about what is that wisdom that queer and trans folks have from our experience and from our networks of mutual aid. But it's not about just saying, you're a restorative justice practitioner and you happen to be queer. It's that being queer is part of the benefit of being able to do this sort of relational intervention in a way that I think would benefit a framework of restorative justice to see not as an add-on, but at the core of how we do this work effectively.
Yeah, I want to make sure I'm not cutting anyone off. Yeah, so I think, right, at two levels, there is a potential for harm as it relates to queer and trans folks. So as Rami sort of mentioned, the legibility of the harm that we face as queer and trans folks, the legibility of that as harm within restorative justice processes, and then within the broader criminal legal system. And then what we know about the way that harm is compounded for queer and trans folks within the criminal legal system, right? How we are overrepresented at just about every stage of interaction with the criminal legal system, from arrest to imprisonment, incarceration, and even reentry, so sort of how that harm happens. So considering that, and we started this conversation a little bit, what does a queer lens offer to formulations of justice, right? And as we say in the restorative justice world, to an understanding of being in right relationship. What does that look like? And if particularly y'all could dig into examples from your own work, I think that that would be really, really helpful.
So for me, when I think about, how would I pinpoint what a queer lens is, or this concept of queer lens in relationship to justice? For me, it is utilizing the playbook of survival that I had to organically build to get through space. And that is not something that I solely own and keep to self, but it's something that really is a compilation of knowledge and wisdom from queer elders who took care of me, because in their own journey, they learned that that was something that was necessary and needed. And so the idea of a queer lens is about looking at a community that sits at multiple compounded intersections of structural violence and knowing that it is a miracle that all of us are sitting here. That's a fact. That is not something to question. It is a miracle that we are sitting here. And so how? How are we sitting here? And understanding that every interaction, the hug that we received from somebody who affirmed us, the time someone spent with us to think through or strategize around our own behavioral changes, whatever that thing was, that support we received, the resource that we were given, the mutual aid that got us through that week or month, that playbook is what automatically gets infused into practice. So what does that look like? For example, with the farm, as a justice space. My queerness in my experience of survival, right? Being queer in this structure, because it has nothing to do with me. It has to do with what I have had to survive in the context. In this space, I've learned that economic justice is crucial. So at the farm, everybody gets paid the same. Nobody's work and time is worth more than anyone else's in that way, right? So economic justice is something that we protect because I learned that. Affirmation, love, and care is something that we protect because I learned that. But I learned it as a 12-year-old coming out in Alabama in the early 2000s. I have to say that because I'm just like my, because we're talking about a generation of affinity group that has different relationships to what autonomy looks like for their whole body, right? So I feel like it has to be named. So I still am of that lingering 90s generation pre-DOMA, right? So in this space. But yeah, for me, it's about understanding and listening to the survival playbook that has been created and understanding that wisdom is invaluable. And to activate that wisdom in our practice is crucial if we want to actually reach a place of liberatory practice.
Space for anyone else to touch on that. Again, like, what are the, because I think like it's very easy for a conversation like this to, I don't want to say devolve, because it is important to know, again, where the gaps are. But it's also very important to know, like, where are we winning? Because we are, to your point, Jazz, we are still alive. We still exist. Queer and trans people are persisting every day. So somehow we are winning. So what are those wins in these justice spaces? What do they look like? How are we showing up? Where do you see that in your work?
Give an example of both my own internalized homophobia and transphobia, and how I've had volunteers and folks in our practice and program really show up in a way that felt really supportive. So, one of the things that, as we're starting our conferences, we invite people to use their pronouns or introduce themselves with their pronouns as an invitation. And to be totally honest, sometimes I don't do that because I'm not sure how safe I feel in the process itself to be able to out myself, right? The burden is on me. So what happens sometimes, not always, but that other people in the circle who are our volunteers or who are practitioners will use their pronouns, and they'll kind of help set the tone or the stage for, we're normalizing, we're not just making assumptions based on how we look or tone of voice or whatnot. And so that for me feels like an important awareness and acknowledgement of, this is my own, these are my own barriers. This is my own learned transphobia coming out, right? So I get to attend to that with compassion and love, hopefully. And what a great opportunity for other folks to really step in and help normalize and kind of create this inclusive space in those practices themselves.
Can I piggyback off that? I love this so much because I think that, again, like the idea of looking at life through a queer lens, or our process and procedures through a queer lens. One thing that I love about community is this idea that we're always learning from each other. Like, I have elder queers that have taught me things, and I have also taught them how to use their email. And we just, we just keep that cycle of love and mutual aid going and going. And one of the things that I learned from a generation behind me, right? So the people who are coming up, those were some young people, and they're like, you really got to stop asking people about their pronouns. Some of us don't even observe pronouns. And I was like, you're right, young one, like, teach me something. And so I started to think, well, what is this coming from queer community, right? Creating space for us to say who we are. What are we as queer folk actually doing? And I really landed on this statement that we're trying to figure out what dignity looks like for each person we care about in this space. And so out of that young person calling me in, I now shifted our practice where at Honeycomb, we say our names and we ask you to share, what does dignity look like for you in the space? Now, I started to ask that, and what I started to actually see is that everybody with invisible disabilities was like, thank you for asking. Let me tell you, I'm going to wiggle, I'm going to wobble, and I'm going to need 10 bathroom breaks. And it's like, thank you. Because what I realized is by walking this road of liberation for us, right, we are actually opening the windows for everyone else. And I think that that's so important to understanding the queer lens, that by trying to explore how to be better for those who are younger than me, who understand the world different than me, I actually was opening doors for people who also sit at other intersections of violence. And that being a really crucial point. I don't know if you even have an answer for this, but I hope you spend the rest of your day wondering, what does dignity look like for you?
I think something else that I've really learned in spaces is, like, really in an embodied sense what it means to practice liberatory harm reduction. I think that that framing is coming to me from Shira Hassan, who's done some really incredible work, particularly with young women in the sex trade, and thinking about, like, how do I genuinely follow the lead of someone around what is harmful to them and support them in not throwing out survival tactics or coping strategies that are why they're still here, while still coming up with strategies that are less harmful to them and other people around them, and celebrating them for the things that they want to be celebrated in. And I think that that is, for me, a deeply queer practice. And it is about like mirroring back to someone how they want to be seen in the world. And the validation that comes from that creates a different foundation for us talking through harm. Like, how do we not cause harm to ourselves and other people? I think you can really only do that work once you affirm what has gotten us here in the first place and what is possible in our options moving forward. And I think that that for me is also very much breaking down the binary between harmed party and person who experienced harm. I think it's Danielle Surratt who said that no one comes into violence for the first time by committing it. And that has certainly been my experience, that there are people who are maybe identified as having experienced harm in this situation and yet are also going to benefit from the skill set of understanding how not to commit harm. And that there are people who are identified as having committed harm who need a lot of space for healing and processing the things that they've gone through in order to come in right relationship and be accountable for what's happening in this situation. And I think having started by doing work specifically with survivors of gender-based violence and having this like light bulb moment of like, oh, we're not just all good people, like people within this room of survivors are also causing harm. And the role of primarily identifying as a survivor is actually partially a distancing tactic from responsibility for harm. And like, everyone is capable of experiencing and committing harm, and everyone can benefit from the skill set of learning to heal and learning to be accountable. And I think that that's like a deeply queer way of approaching harm in our society and within ourselves, right?
Yeah, something, all of that is, so important. Something that I want to like uplift in what was shared. Oftentimes in definitions of restorative justice, we offer that restorative justice allows us to meet needs in a pro-social way, right? And I think it's important that we think of what does it mean to meet needs in a pro-social way for groups of people, queer and trans folks, who have been considered on the periphery or outside of society, right? So how are the ways that we meet our needs in community, in our lives, how are they being structured as healthy, pro-social, whatever the case may be? Or how are they not legible in that way because of, again, how dominant society is structured? I just think that's such an important point that I wanted to double tap. Did I just age myself? Beautiful. Again, I want to make sure I didn't cut anyone off there. Okay. So something else I would love y'all's thoughts on, right? I think we're in maybe because I'm 27, it feels like a particular political moment, but maybe it's really just part of a long arc. But it feels like we are in a particular moment where there are increased attacks on efforts to expand diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is at UCSF, y'all's Diversity Week, right? Mm-hmm. That's correct. So from where I'm from, where we're from, the South, we see a lot of these sort of attacks on DEI, which has already led to restructuring of RJ programs, right, that may have been housed under an equity and inclusion office. And so we had to learn how to pivot. So I think understandably, for some folks, this idea of we need to, we've already been having a conversation and we need to continue having a conversation of racial equity and restorative justice. But now we want to add to that conversation of queer and trans justice. There may be some apprehension of like, we're already under attack. So I wonder, right, like, how do we move in this moment in a way, again, that centers queer and trans perspectives, but still allows us to be strategic, allows us to move in space, in institutions, and in community. Think about our funding that oftentimes comes from government and philanthropic places. So I know that's a big question, but I'm just curious, like, how are you thinking about how we're moving? How do you see it already impacting your work? And maybe how are you pivoting?
I really appreciate, Saj, you talking about so much of the TJ work being informed by practices that come from organizing. The RJ movement is in desperate need of PR and organizers. I love that Fanya Davis was like in her book, I love the little book of Restorative Justice and Race, that like justice folk need like a little bit more healer, and healer folk need a little bit more justice. I think that restorative justice as a movement desperately needs organizers. Why? One thing that I've learned, and shout out to Momentum and all of the beautiful work that they've done incubating amazing movement groups like Sunrise Movement, or if not now, Movement for Black Lives, that in their process and how they think is you're building an understanding of your aspiration down to its most whittled down core goal. So for me, everything I've ever done is about well-being. So they can't take that from me. And I think that also becomes out of strategies of being a part of communities that have had boots on their necks already, where you have limited movement. So that means you're having to hide your healing under the table. So how does that connect to the moment that we're in right now? No, our work is in jeopardy. And the departments, the initiatives, the programs that are going to be financially supported, that will then lose that supporting, that have been partnered with restorative justice, are going to be impacted. So how do we take our healing and hide it under the table? For me, that's well-being. For me, that's strategic design. How I practice those things that are acceptable in this growingly aggressive space is my practice. I don't have to advertise what I do to do what I do. You come into my meeting, it's in circle. You come into my home and you have conflicts, you will be heard. You come to the farm, you will eat. That it is in the practice that we continue to find support. So if I had something that was threatened, and being in government, I often did have like projects or programs that I knew that the language around them was going to be challenged in a way that would not allow it to live beyond me. I started to hide it under the table. So what does it look like to create policies and procedures that will live beyond me, but communicate care? What does it look like to build MOUs that will live beyond me, but say that this is a requirement of our practice, and it has to be something that's protected in this partnership, and this is what's going to happen if not. So really thinking about not getting too caught up on them taking the window dressing of these words, them ripping these curtains down, right? No more DEI, no more justice, no more. No, because our work is beyond the words. Our work is not the words. Our work is community. Our work is well-being. Our work is accountability that lives beyond this moment. And so preparing ourselves, like in movement structure, to have a long, sustainable run means we're having to whittle down our work to its core gift. Whatever we see that is. And I feel like every practitioner is going to have their own understanding of what that is. But that is where we're not going to be able to negotiate down, right? They're not going to be able to yank down well-being, care.
Yeah. So thank you. That was amazing. Thinking about kind of that global idea, at least for me, of restorative justice, a way of being, right? I think partially how we do this is by showing up and being our full blown selves. Like we ourselves are in jeopardy, personally, physically, right? Like we are. And so similarly to, let's get to the core of our work, let's get to the core of ourselves, and then be brave enough to show up as we can within the context of being held within our communities. And that takes work, right? That takes intention, that takes bravery, that takes vulnerability and falling down and all of the things that we know. And in light of kind of the queer community and celebration of that, supporting one another and believing and trusting that we can be there to support each other in our fullness and how we show up.
For me, I would say, having come from a place where survival was the only way to be myself, it's so it can be really exhausting and a lot of fatigue, emotional fatigue, and seeing all these hundreds and hundreds of bills attacking our community first. And then moving into restorative justice, how can I use my skills and my tools to support my community when my community is in crisis? Because, I mean, there are a lot of people who are tired, who don't feel like they can be brave or safe in a space, who cannot show up anymore. So what is our role as restorative justice practitioners or people in community who still feel like we can show up to our communities, even if it's outside of government restorative justice spaces or higher ed restorative justice spaces? How do we do the community work?
I love drag. I love performing drag. I love watching drag. I love performing. I said it twice. Supporting other performers. And I think there's a very deep queer technology of reclaiming what is other people's and queering it, even just the term queer, right? Maybe not the best thing to say, but I don't love DEI. I think the idea of like bringing diverse people to the same messy table, I want to see it redesigned to actually work for us. I think I love equity. I think the idea of diversity, I've supported a lot of organizations and groups that they're like, we get the people here and then all of a sudden we're not diverse anymore. And I'm like, well, you have a retention problem, not a recruitment problem. And your retention problem is because you're bringing people into a system that was not designed for them. So it's not a numbers issue. It's a root cause issue, right? And so the reason why people are attacking DEI is super annoying, but I don't think that DEI is it. I don't think that's gonna like solve liberation. I think there are deeper things that we need to be designing towards. And I think there's a benefit to taking words that are going to keep showing up and queering their definition. And I think, for example, accountability. People are not gonna stop talking about accountability at workplaces. Accountability to your tasks and did you do da-da-da-da. So like, I haven't been in very many spaces where they're not willing to have a conversation about accountability and follow through in work. And once we're talking about accountability, then we can be thinking about some of the different factors in effectively practicing accountability as a group. Having accountable organizations to the people who are impacted by their services. Thinking about accountability not just as a top-down kind of supervision concept, but as a bottom-up mechanism to push back against power. So I'm thinking, what are terms and ideas that are going to be there that we can queer? How can we drag it up? How can we show up in the space as ourselves, but using the words that they're going to keep using and turn it on its head so that they can't kick us out or else they'd have to kick themselves out?
Okay, I want to check on time. Actually, I think I would like, before we go to any of our closing statements, to turn to folks in the room for questions. If there's folks who have questions, maybe we can pass a mic with having that mic that you have. And if there aren't any, we can keep discussing. But I want to make sure, again, Talia spoke to the beauty of being in space together. So let's use that. Any questions?
I can move in these.
Hi, awesome presentation. My name's Charles. I'm a staff member here. My question kind of relates to what you were just talking about, but what would be your message to truly inspire people that might not feel hopeful right now for LGBTQ rights? In big major American cities, you often see that there's a level of safety and a home for folks. However, it seems like obviously when you look at things across the country, it's not going so great, and rights can be taken away, and there's attacks on folks in our community. what would your message be to inspire folks that might be on the couch right now, that might be a little complacent, that might need to step up besides just opening up their wallets? What does that look like for you in your work and your organizing? And what kind of language would you use specifically as well? So that's my question. Sorry.
It's a beautiful one. Thank you.
So I recently watched this documentary by Charles Blow. He's a writer, columnist for the New York Times, and he's speaking about his book. And in his book, he really talks about like ending hope. And I think I'm with him a little bit. So if you'll rock with me, I actually am feeling like if you are feeling hopeless, feel that. Feel that. Allow yourself to feel that. Allow yourself to grieve promises that were not made, that were not actualized. Allow yourself to grieve a reality that may not have shifted in the decades you've been on Earth, but then strategize. I think that in the wake of all of this that feels present, there's so much history for us that you could look back and be like, okay, we look at the strategies of our elders, our ancestors, our queer folk who survived unbelievable things, from queer people surviving Berlin in the 1930s to queer people surviving New York in the 1970s. What we have are playbooks. I don't have to be hopeful because I have a guide. I don't have to be hopeful because I can strategize and I have community. And if I don't have community, if you're that person sitting on a couch and you're like, I am lost, go to the internet and find your people. I really want to just emphasize the power of queer people connecting virtually as a way of strategizing. You can organize, you can be a contributing person towards liberation and stay on that couch and not feel hopeful. But what you must do is allow yourself to grieve, and you must allow yourself to find your own way into strategy that fits your body. It might be small, it might be big, but I am definitely moving towards, I don't have time for hope. I have time to work and rest and love on people. But hope is something that I think has continuously been sold to me, particularly as a Southerner. And my elders didn't have hope. They had no choice. And I think about a woman who was speaking about the survival of Palestinian children. And she was speaking globally, really, about an experience that I understand looking at children, both in my own family and in our urban centers that are, quote, born dead. So what does it mean to be born dead? It means that everything else is survival. So if you are feeling hopeless, it's because your body knows. Your body knows that this threat is existential. And so I think it is of vital importance that survival comes from remembering that you didn't survive first, that you are a product of elders who came before you, and that there's a role for you now.
I also think hope is like about the future, like an abstract future. And I think for me, like I end every day reflecting on like, how did I experience and witness liberation today? And sometimes that means that people were acting wild and I couldn't control it, but they were free. They were doing their thing, you know? But I think that like, I don't do this work just for some abstract future. I do it for the ability to experience liberation now, to have pockets. Maybe it's a minute. Maybe it's the moment that I'm doing my experimental lipstick. Maybe it's a moment of play with friends. Maybe it's a moment of creation with children. Maybe it's a moment of reflection with elders. We can carve out those moments in our days and not just be in a place of sacrifice for the future or hopelessness. Nothing that I do will have this outcome. And I think that for me, I am a very playful person. I love laughter. I love joy. I love creativity. And I surround myself with it. There's not a week that goes by that I'm not doing something ridiculous with people. And that means I have something to hold on to that I'm fighting for in a very tangible and real sense. And I'm not just surrounded by suffering, but my like the amount of suffering that I can tolerate witnessing and being around is built up by the amount of play and joy and laughter that I kind of fill myself with. And so I'm able to go deep in the darkness because of how much light I surround myself with. And so I think that I was with a group of like mostly 18 and 19-year-olds last week, and one of them said, I'm really grieving the loss of my childhood. And how do you navigate being an adult in the world? And I was like, my childhood never ended. I was really adultified as a child, and I did a lot of work to bring that childhood into my adult life. And that makes me so happy, and it makes me happy to show other people that that's possible as well. And that's possible in this Black queer body that is a survivor, that's experienced these things. Nothing can take that laughter from me. And that in and of itself is extremely powerful. And that's what I am always trying to invite people into, including in processes. How can we bring playfulness into processes? How can we I love co-creating fantasy with people in processes. Sometimes when they're really stuck around what's possible in this world, I'm like, well, what if this was happening on an alien planet? And let's think about some other factors that might be true about that alien planet. And then you're having new ideas about what we might do moving forward. And how can we bring those parallels back to this world? And I think it can really help us move through some stuck energy. And that would be something that I'd really zoom in on, is like, what is the thing that you can find in your life that is joyful, that is playful, and how can you carve that out in your life on a day-to-day basis? Because we're not looking for the most right now. We're looking for what you can give sustainably forever. We want you, we want the next generation, we want you into your elderhood. And I'm tired of hearing about people burning out from movement, because we need long-term sustainable commitments. And that's not on the individuals who throw themselves in, that's within a norm of sacrifice and martyrdom within our communities. And I don't want that for us. I don't want us to do it for other people. I want us to do it with other people and for ourselves, and to experience the thing that we're advocating for now.
Yeah. Toni Morrison, just to add to that, Toni Morrison says that if you are free, your duty then is to free somebody else. So if you find that corner, those pockets, how can you also offer that to somebody else? And I'm a musical theater queer from way back. It reminds me of a lyric from Edwin Drood. If you hear my voice, then you're alive. What a bloody marvel we survived. So if you are still here,
Yes,
you have found a way. You have found a way. That is not by luck. Speaking particularly to queer and trans folks. So you may not feel it right now, but you're here, and that matters. And think about how you can extend it to someone else.
I would like to speak to allies as well, and saying it's not enough to just go to Pride or to kiki with your gay friends and think that's, being an ally. You have to actually honor queer people, center them, support queer leadership, something tangible. Allies as well can cause harm to queer people unintentionally. So reassess how you show up or what you say to the queer communities around you.
We have a question here, and then I saw your hand too.
Yeah, it's job season right now, and it feels like to get where I want to go, I have to cut myself into little pieces and put stuff in a box in the back of my closet, in a million ways, from the way that I look, the way that I talk, how I introduce myself, and all of that. And it's yucky, but I don't see anybody where I want to be that looks, talks, is like me. And so how did you guys do it? And what is that? You know what I mean?
the best advice I ever received around that is your job does not have to be your political home. I received that way too late. I was looking at my job, and you can look at my resume and see how I popped around. I'm just like, new place. I wish I would have learned that earlier. Because what I found in balance is that my job is my job. whatever it is. And then I have beauty and community, like the farm, where I get to practice and imagine all of these new futures that I want to be a part of in real time, all day long, and I find joy there. I have little to say about the elder piece besides the fact that I share that with you. I don't look around and I see anyone at this space that I'm in right now that looks like me, that does work like me, that moves like me. And so I've really been trying to have intergenerational conversations with myself. How can I speak to a younger version of myself and pull some of their fire? Because that person was raw. And how do I speak to the future elder that I'm becoming and really call in the strength that I'm struggling to see in my own community, in my own bonds?
And you look like you. You sound like you.
Right?
There's somebody in this world who needs to hear what you have to say exactly how you're going to say it. And so I know that that doesn't help you get the job right now, but I hope that once you get the job, you realize that like you can't put it on the back burner forever because somebody needs you in particular.
First of all, thank you so much for being here, offering your wisdom and creating this space. So I've heard that some folks show up differently in these movement spaces, especially as queer folks. I feel like some people are more under attack than others or feel more comfortable like being their true selves in spaces. As a person who's going to be a movement lawyer, hopefully, being queer and a person of color, like how do you choose the balance between calling people out or calling people in, especially when you are representing somebody and you know they're in a terrible situation? How do you deal with that power structure in that moment? Do you call it out or do you call it in? Or if you are in a position of power and you're that one queer person and you see a system is failing your community, do you call those people out or do you call them in? I feel like I see a generational split right now where a lot of younger folks are calling it out, but there's like a generation above that's like, you know, that's not how we do stuff here. And I feel like that for me going into this space as a future attorney, it's really conflicting because I don't want to be that, you know, aggressive queer person, but also at the same time, like if that's what you guys, is that the only way you guys are going to hear us out, then potentially that's how it's going to come across. So what advice would you offer in that realm?
I can relate a lot to that because I feel like when I show up in spaces, sometimes people are like, oh, you're like a diva, or like, don't say those things, or I would always encourage calling things out because to me, if someone is called out and doesn't feel comfortable, then they've caused harm and they know it. And now they're starting to think of ways they can save themselves. So I'm always now I found my voice in being able to say, I don't appreciate that. That isn't appropriate. I'm not going to be silent in certain spaces. I used to be because financially, you know, I need a job. If I spoke back to a boss, I don't want to get fired. But at this point, I feel like past me or younger me would have needed that. So I think it's assessing the situation, but I'm always a proponent of speaking out and calling homophobia or transphobia out.
I think it's good to know like yourself and your tendencies. Like I have been a real troublemaker in my life, and I've dealt with a lot of consequences for that. I think that, you know, I love training people around conflict and what it means for conflict to be a generative force in our lives. But I also think that like I'm in conflict with like everything all the time. Like I go to the grocery store in conflict. I wake up and I'm in conflict with the radio. We live in a world that was not designed for me to not be in conflict with it, you know? And so I think that like if I can find things to challenge everywhere all the time, then that's not very sustainable for me. And it's also not like I can't follow through on the things that I actually am ready to be committed to addressing in that moment. So I've learned to be a lot more strategic in my life. And with whatever project I'm working on, coming back to that term accountability, I think about like, who am I accountable to in this project? Always starting with myself, right? But then thinking about, say I'm advocating for somebody, what is going to be strategic for that person as well is important, you know? And I think that, like, I was a very competitive policy debater in high school, and I learned a lot about argumentation. And I know that in most situations I can win my argument if I set myself up for success and I do my research, right? But that means I need to pick the argument, I need to prepare myself, and I need to follow through and have the outcome that I'm looking for. And if I get caught up in every single thing that happens along the way, I'm not going to have the outcome that I'm looking for. Now, that doesn't mean like you see something egregious happen, you're like, oh, not my problem because I'm focusing on this other issue. I think that there's, like, for me, somatics and embodiment has been a huge part of the learning. I could rationalize anything to myself, but if I'm in tune with what my body is telling me, I will know when the impulse is, no, I need to reevaluate my priorities in this moment and address this situation. So I think that, like, starting my day with an embodiment practice, when I'm going into an intense situation, grounding beforehand and actually not dissociating to be as effective in the moment, but like noticing when things are coming up for me and asking myself, what is this inviting me to tend to? But I think that if I actually addressed every single thing that I saw in my life, I wouldn't be very effective at any of those things. So I need to pick the things that are actually right. And when I'm picking that, deeply thinking about solidarity with other people and not just focusing on the things that directly impact me. Because I think it's very easy to say, if I have limited capacity, I can only address so many things. I should be addressing the things that, like, I'm personally impacted by. But I think it's a lot easier to focus on the ways that we're oppressed than on the privileges that we have, especially as marginalized folks. And it's also really important to show up in solidarity with other people's issues. And so I think the only way that I could really identify what the right things are through an embodiment practice.
Beautiful. Okay, we're at time. I just want to give our panelists one quick brief word. What do you want to leave the folks with? And then we'll wrap it up. So just a little bit of lasting wisdom. We can hop around. You don't have to feel.
It's the brief that's got me on the chokeholds.
I think for me, growing up, I never imagined being able to start a LGBTQ nonprofit in the United States or anywhere really. So just not stopping yourself because you don't see someone who has gone to certain positions that doesn't look like you. So just keep trying to make your dreams a reality.
I'll say your queerness is an asset, whether you identify as queer sexually or not. Whatever is queer about you is not something to tolerate. It's something to celebrate. It's something to see as a unique wisdom that shapes what makes you able to do things in the special way that is you. And so I would say, like, whatever your identity is, celebrate the queerness that is part of you.
I think I would just say, let's have this be a continued conversation. Like, let's not have it stop here, right? But, and not that this is the first ever, but like, let's build upon the connections and opportunities to have these conversations in a way that continues to strengthen and be committed to liberation for all.
Something that feels very loud for me right now is like also breaking down the othering of this space and really thinking about, I personally, one of my heroes is Steve Bantubiku from South Africa, and their definition of Black and Blackness expanded to all those who experience structural violence. And I'm paraphrasing, but Biko says that until the white woman and the Indian man understand that they too are Black, they will never be free. And so when we're having conversations about this group, disability justice, if we're having environmental justice, if we're talking about LGBTQIA plus two-spirit justice, the reality is that it is collective. And so if you can see yourself in this expanded identity of those who do not benefit from the oppression of others, which nobody does, then you can walk into a space where you are no longer seeing yourself as an ally, but you're seeing yourself as somebody who has just as much stake as I am, who also has the experience of being born dead. Because if they have already tried to kill you, you have nothing to lose. And so if you are willing to walk into the space of expanding your identity and ownership of it, then to quote close, I will read the last, some of the last stanzas from Gwendolyn Brooks' Paul Robeson poem. We are each other's harvests. We are each other's business. We are each other's magnitude and bond. And so I welcome you into this big expanded rainbow that is queerness, this expanded identity of all of those who do not benefit from the oppression of others.
Beautiful. Thank you all so much.
Oh, hold on, Demoite. You have to give a close too. Don't even think you can sneak out that way.
Well, thank you for that invitation. I think what I would humbly offer, I think, again, I just want to double tap what Ames offered, this idea that like this conversation is not a one-off. We are not the only people thinking and doing this work. There are so many other people who are having these conversations, building the strategy, making the playbooks for the here and now and the future. So just continue. Don't let this be the end all be all. Just keep moving forward.
So I want to thank each of our folks that are sitting up here, Demoite, Jazz, Ames, Stas, and Rami. It's been a pleasure to be in relationship with you in the past and now in this future moment. I want to thank everyone who joined us online. I recognize we actually had a really robust and exciting group of people that signed up and hopefully spent some time with us. And for each of you, even though I know that class was starting and some folks had to leave, I have never been in a room yet where it didn't empty right at end time. So that speaks volumes in the silent ways, but also really in powerful ways. So I thank everyone for being here. And it's deeply appreciative that we could gather, and it's beautiful outside. So to the extent you don't have something that's calling to you right after this, I think that our folks are happy to step outside and have some continued conversations. So with that, we are totally over time, but that's okay. So take care, everyone. Thanks so much.
Gracias.